Hi, my name is Ben Bristow and I'm the lead DJ instructor here at Point Blank Music College, and in this Rekordbox 3 tutorial I'm going to take you through the process of analysing your music, saving cue points, setting your grids correctly, and then transferring music onto your USB stick so you can use it with Rekordbox compatible CDJs. There's lots of advantages in doing this. One of the main ones being that the BPM values that show up on your CDJs are going to be a lot more accurate if you've processed the music with Rekordbox, and also the advantage of having quantized loops, so you can have mathematically perfect loops and obviously cue points that you can recall having prepared them not on a pair of decks. So the first step is to get your music into the collection. So I'm going to go to the Explorer section here, click on my desktop. That will show me any tracks that are on my desktop. Obviously you can go outside of Rekordbox and drag them from a hard drive into collection. It's just basically you've got to drop them into collection for Rekordbox to be able to analyze the tracks. So I'm going to select a few tracks here. Now I'm going to drag and drop them into my collection area. So then if I click in collection, you'll see that it's now analyzing the tracks and putting the beat grids where it thinks it needs to go. It's pretty accurate, but it's always worth checking because you're never sure whether it's got it exactly right, especially if the track starts with an intro and there's not beats at the beginning of the track. It sometimes struggles. So if I drag and drop the first or one of the tunes into the player up here, you can see these grid markers here, which it's placed at the start of each beat. So one thing you should probably check before doing that is the preferences. So if I go to preferences, really you want to check what type of analysis it's going to do. So if you go to the analysis tab here, you've got two options, normal or dynamic. So normal is basically for tracks that have been made on a computer where the tempo doesn't vary, so it will pick out the peaks in the waveform and place markers at equal distances apart from one another. Whereas if you're analysing tracks that have been played by live bands like funk or reggae or anything like that, you might want to put it on a dynamic analysis mode, because then it will find the peaks in the waveform and will put grid markers on those peaks, but they're not necessarily all the same distance apart. Here you've got the key analysis. If you've got enable key analysis on import ticked, then Rekordbox is going to analyse the key of your tracks, and if this option's ticked, write the value to the ID3 tag, it's going to overwrite any key information that's already in your ID3 tags. If you've used something like mixed in key or any other key analysis software, you might end up overwriting that information. So if you don't want it to do that, obviously have these deselected. This basically looks quite good, but I'm going to double check it. So if I click on the grid tab here, I've actually got a metronome that I can activate, and that will click in time with where the beat grids are. So if I play the track, you'll hear the tick. Hopefully it will be in time because it looks like the grid markers are actually lined up with my beats here. So you can hear and pretty much see that it's pretty accurate. Now, if it wasn't in the right place, say the first grid marker was in the wrong place, what you can do is zoom in. So if I zoom in here with the plus icon, I can see it is lined up, but it might be that it's slightly off. So you've got several different options to manipulate the grid. So these two here, this shrinks, or this one expands the gaps between each grid marker. So you might think that the metronome is too fast for the track, for example, so you would expand the intervals between the grid markers, and hopefully that would make them line up more accurately. So, and if it was, too slow, you'd have to speed up the metronome and shrink the gap between the grid intervals, so that would be shrinking the beat intervals. Not often that you would have to do that, but sometimes. So the main thing you might have to do is actually move the whole grid left or right. So if I click this one, what you can see if I zoom out slightly is now all the grid markers have moved to the left. So you can see the whole grid is shifting to the left. So it might be you drop a tune in and the grid isn't quite lined up. So if you click this one, it's going to shift the grid up to the beats, and then check whether it's clicking in time with the track. And you can hear there it is pretty accurate. It's always worth checking further along in the track. So if I click here, the needle drops function, you can kind of hear that it is still staying in time. Now if you found that it was in time for a little while and then it started to drift off, that's what this section here is about. So this allows you to lock the grid up to a certain point, and then after that point you can start manipulating it. So for example, if I found that this was a point where the grid markers were fine up until this particular point here, if I click this button, you can now see that all these grid intervals, or grid markers, sorry, before that point have been locked, whereas now after the point that I've locked, you can still shrink or expand the intervals. Now the ×2 and divide by 2 buttons basically double or half the number of grid markers. So if you put a drum and bass tune in here, for example, it might think that it's 86 beats per minute instead of 172 beats per minute. So if it's only put a grid marker on every other beat, it's going to be getting the BPM wrong here. So what you would do then is press ×2. Now you can see it's doubled the number of grid markers. So this is a house track and it's thinking it's 256 BPM, which it isn't. So I'll divide by 2 and then it goes back to being the real value. So you might find with dubstep, for example, which is generally 140 beats per minute, you put it in Rekordbox and it comes up as 70 beats per minute. So if you wanted it to be accurate, you could press the ×2 button. That would double the number of grid markers and therefore be more precise in terms of the actual BPM of your track. Then you've got an undo button, so if you do something wrong, you can just undo that. So there, I'll press divide by 2 again to get back to where I need it to be. So that track looks alright, it's pretty accurate. If I drag another tune in, different genre this time. So now this might have issues because there isn't a beat at the very beginning of the track, it's just a kind of crowd intro. So if I go to the first beat, it does actually appear to be in time. So really these are the options. If you're familiar with Traktor's beat grids, it's very similar. You can expand or shrink the intervals between the grid markers. You can move the whole grid left or right. If you were finding that it was completely out, this one here is set the first beat of a bar to where you've placed the cursor. So if I drag another tune in, let's say I wanted the first beat of the bar to be here, for example. If I press that one, it will now put a red marker there. So it's saying that red markers represent the first beat of the bar. So it's now put one exactly where I placed it. In this case it's wrong because the actual first beat of the bar is here, so I'll just put it there, press that. Now you can see there's one red beat marker every 4, because obviously there's 4 beats in a bar with most dance music. So here we can hear it's on beat 1 now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's basically set a new marker if it's struggling. So it's quite useful to be able to just double check. I mean, if you're using all house music or anything with a steady beat, it tends to be pretty accurate, but it's worth double checking if you're going to rely on quantized loops and so on. You don't want the grid to be wrong, because what will happen is the loop points will snap to those grid markers. Now if I go to the cue section, you've got loops and cues, hot cues, and 10 cue points, same as on a CDJ. So I might want to save a cue point. So let's say I wanted a cue point so that I could recall later on the drop of this track. So I'll find where I want there to be the cue point. Press Q, so that's kind of temporarily set it. But if I want to commit it to memory so that I can recall it, if I press memory here, you can now see it's added the cue point up here. And as you saw in my last tutorial, you can actually click in here and name it. So I'll just call it the drop. Now that's going to be recallable. When I load up my tracks on a CDJ, I can use the call buttons on the CDJ itself, and that can load up the cue points basically. You've also got loops which you can save, and I can save those in the same way. So if I go to a section and then create a loop, quantize is on, by the way, so this is going to make, when I press in and out, it's going to actually snap my loop points to the grid markers. So I better just double check that's accurate. See here, the grid markers are slightly off, so what I could do, if I go back to my grid section, I can actually shift that slightly so it's exactly on the beats. So just a couple of notches to the left. Now that sounds right. So if I want to create a loop, if I make sure quantize is on, now when I press in and out, it will actually, even if I press in and out slightly out of time, it will snap those points to the grid. So you can see it's created a 4-beat loop. You know, these here are different lengths of loop in beats. So I could, if I press number 8, make it a 2-bar loop, because that's 8 beats. So if you count, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now if I want to save that, again, just press memory, and it shows up as a loop here. Now, if you're using CDJ 2000 Nexus decks, you've got the advantage of making your loops active loops. So if I click that, it's basically now an active loop, which means if I'm playing the track from before that loop point, when it gets to it, it will activate itself and continue to loop. So that's very useful if you're playing short tunes, or you definitely want to loop the end of a track. You could set an active loop right at the end of your track, and you wouldn't have to worry about activating it yourself. It would just activate when it got to that point. Now, what I need to do is transfer my tracks onto my USB stick. So basically export the tracks. So there's different ways of doing this. My device that I've plugged into my computer, my USB stick, is showing up here. So if I literally just select the tracks that are in collection, if I right click or control click on a Mac, I've got the option to export tracks. So when I go to export tracks, that is my USB stick. So if I do that, it's basically going to export the tracks to the USB, and then they'll show up under tracks or the different sort options that you have in Rekordbox. Personally, what I tend to do is create a playlist and then drag the tracks into that playlist. So at least then I've got them in a specific playlist rather than all my tracks being mixed up. So I'm on my USB stick here. So what I'm going to do is click on the playlist section, click the plus sign to create a new playlist. So I'm going to call it Processed Mr. Bristow Tracks. Now, if I go back to collection, I've selected all my tunes in collection, which are on my computer itself. Now I'm going to left click and hold and drag and drop those onto that playlist. And you should see it say exporting. So it's now exported my tracks onto the USB stick with that grid information and my saved cue points or loops or anything that I've done here and committed to memory. So if I now click on the playlist on my USB itself, you can see there's the tracks. So you've got to make sure you actually make Rekordbox export the tracks. Don't drag and drop your tunes from in Rekordbox and then take it outside of Rekordbox and drop it onto the key on your desktop, because then it's going to bypass all the grid information and everything, and it won't, the tracks won't have been processed. So it does mean you have to make a copy of the tracks onto the stick itself. So if you've already got the tracks on your USB, you're then going to process them with Rekordbox and then copy them into a Rekordbox playlist onto the key. It means you'd have 2 copies of that track. So if you don't see it say exporting down here, it won't have actually copied them. So hopefully that's been helpful. Just make sure you check your grids, and it does have a lot of advantages, as I said, about quantizing your loops and having the grid information, and also the waveform display which shows up on the larger CDJ screens. So until next time, thanks a lot.